The biggest problem is that we have major geopolitical conflict, not only U.S. and Russia, but also U.S. and China. So, and again, with a tremendous amount of provocation coming from the U.S. side as well. So we're breaking any sense of stability right now. For the moment, many in Europe are saying, well, the U.S. is our closest ally. We need to hold on. But watch what's happening politically. There's upheaval in Europe, country after country right now. We're entering a period of enormous instability, and we're unstable in the United States as well. We went through an insurrection. We're still not past that. So we're entering the most unstable geopolitical era in many decades. We're entering the first hyperinflation in more than 40 years, and we're entering the first escalation to the nuclear precipice in 60 years. 60 years exactly this month was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this is the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's an extraordinary overload, and we see no attempt to tamp this down, to quiet it down. Every day is about escalation. We're going to defeat the other side. We have our rights. We can stand up to what we want. We have Speaker Pelosi flying to Taiwan. Right. So many provocations in the midst of huge instability. Well, Europe is in a very, very sharp economic downturn. The sharp decline of output and living standards also shows up as a rise of prices. But the main fact is that the European economy is getting hammered by this, by the sudden cutoff of energy. And now, to make it definitive, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which I would bet was a U.S. action, perhaps U.S. and Poland. This is
Jeff, we got to stop there. That's quite a statement as well. Why do you feel that was a U.S. action? What evidence do you have of that?
Well, first of all, there's direct radar evidence that U.S. helicopters, military helicopters that are normally based in Gdansk, were circling over this area. We also had the threats from the United States earlier in this year that one way or another, we are going to end Nord Stream. We also have a remarkable statement by Secretary Blinken last Friday in a press conference. He says, this is also a tremendous opportunity. It's a strange way to, it's a strange way to talk if you're worried about the piracy on international infrastructure of vital significance. So I know this runs counter to our narrative. You're not allowed to say these things in the West. But the fact of the matter is, all over the world, when I talk to people, they think the U.S. did it. And just to tell you, and by the way, even reporters on our papers that are involved tell me privately, yeah, well, of course, but it doesn't show up in our media.
The world is falling into fragmented groups, and there will be extraordinarily high costs from this. The sanctions that the United States and Europe have put on have done a tremendous damage to Europe and the United States and to much of the rest of the world. And we're feeling the brunt of now a strong stagflation, which was the main topic facing the central bank leaders that were in Sintra, Portugal. This is likely a hard landing in much of the world coming up in the next months. I think that our foreign policy strategy, both towards China and towards Russia, has been provocative and divisive for a number of years. This didn't just start now. There was already the U.S. trade wars on China, and then the technology wars, the financial sanctions, and all the rest. We've divided the world, and now we're paying a strong, heavy cost for that. When Putin said NATO should not expand to Ukraine and Georgia, I would have been the first one to say absolutely correct. Why do something so provocative, something akin to the Crimean War back in 1853? We shouldn't be having a Black Sea confrontation. So we should have been prudent. Putin said last year, negotiate over the non-enlargement of NATO. Biden said, absolutely not. That's off the table. We are going to expand. We're committed to having NATO not only in Ukraine, but all the way across to the eastern edge of the Black Sea in Georgia. This is a huge expansion of NATO. NATO was a defensive alliance of Western Europe against the Soviet Union, a defensive alliance against a country that doesn't exist. And yet we said it will continue to expand all the way to the eastern edge of the Black Sea. And Russia kept saying, no, for 30 years. I was there at the beginning when this discussion started. Russia was saying, don't do that. Gorbachev was saying, don't do that. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister in 1990, said, don't worry, we won't move 1 inch. Now, this isn't to say that this isn't to say that that is what started the war. The war was started by Putin. But the United States has been provocative also towards China. And my point, Richard, is we're paying a heavy economic cost. That cost is likely to rise. That at the end of March, negotiations were advancing for a neutral Ukraine and for an end of the war. And then Ukraine walked away from the negotiating table at the end of March. And the reason is that the UK and the US pressed them. You can win on the battlefield. You don't have to negotiate non-enlargement of NATO. This was a big mistake. My point is simply that we need this war to end with Russia leaving Ukraine and NATO saying we're not going to fill in the void. Ukraine is going to be neutral. And this is how we could also save the world economy as well as saving Ukraine. It's very straightforward. Russia needs to leave, but the United States doesn't need to fill in afterwards. That's the basic point. We need a buffer.
Was attacked in the Atlantic for being on the side of peace. And I confess I'm on the side of peace. I am very worried that we are on a path of escalation to nuclear war, nothing less than that. We have essentially a war in which Russia feels that this war is at the core of its security interests. The United States insists that it will do anything to support Ukraine's defeat of Russia. Russia views this as a proxy war with the United States. And whatever one thinks about this, this is a path of extraordinarily dangerous escalation. And I am very fearful.
Right. You lived this with Yeltsin. You were there for Gorbachev and Yeltsin and the rest. I remember when you got off the airplane at JFK, essentially shattered over the collapse of that first experiment. Do you have a feeling that Mr. Putin is alone? Is his military in support of him?
A lot of the world is watching the events in horror, and a lot of the world doesn't like this NATO expansion, which they interpret as at the core of this. They want to see compromise between the U.S. and Russia in vote after vote in the United Nations. Basically, it's been the Western countries that have been voting for sanctions and denunciations and other actions, whereas most of the world, certainly most of the world counted by population, is on the sidelines. They just view this as a horrible clash between Russia and the United States. They don't view this as we describe it in the media as an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine. That's, anyone in the United States, they'd say, well, what else is it? But that's because the way that our media have been reporting this. This conflict goes back a long time. It didn't start on February 24th. 2022 would go. In fact, the war itself started in 2014, not in 2022. And even that had antecedents. And so most of the world doesn't see it the way we describe it, but most of the world's just terrified right now, frankly, because it's unbelievable to be hearing on one side, well, we'll use nuclear weapons if we need to, and the other side saying, you can't frighten us.